The following program is not a New Channels production, and New Channels has no responsibility for the content or opinions expressed therein.
The town of Volney would like to welcome everyone here. Okay, at this meeting, we have several town board members from the town of Volney. Jess Warner, myself, Supervisor Howard Rose. We also have Bob Weston from the city of Fulton. We also have in attendance several of the legislatures from the Oswego County: Earl Chesbrough, Barbara Brown, Lloyd Boynton, Russ Johnson, Shirley Tabor. Mark Lichtenstein, also from the county, who is the Deputy Superintendent of Solid Waste, is here to answer any questions about what the county has done so far and what their position is on everything. The keynote speaker for tonight is Dr. Judith Johnsrud. She's a PhD. She's the director of the Environmental Coalition on Nuclear Power in Pennsylvania. She has represented on the Pennsylvania Commission on Radioactive Waste. She's the past chair of Sierra Club's National Energy Committee. This past year, she was on the panel for the Secretary of Energy concerning the management of spent fuel, and she's been on 2 NRC panels for state compatibility requirements and the decommissioning criteria. We're going to start out with about 15-minute overview of some important points that Dr. Johnsrud feels that we all should have as background information to start the discussion, and then we'll open it up to questions. Mark Lichtenstein is also available for questions during that time period. Just when you have your question, state which person it's for. Thank you.
I'm glad to be back at Volney. I think you've had a busy time since I was here. Gosh, how long ago was that? Several months.
They can't hear you.
Can't hear, so I will hold this little piece down, Penny?
Yes, thank you.
Good, okay. And let me know if you can. I had understood that we would have a very informal meeting tonight, and I wanted to maximize the opportunity for questions for you, from you, and discussion with you concerning the tangle of issues associated with radioactive waste. And I'm not quite sure about this. I don't know whether the electronic equipment is on and ready to go. But it is my understanding that we have the videotape of a series concerning an existing radioactive waste site, a tape that was put together by the Syracuse WIXT reporter, Channel 9. Gene Kessler by name, who has had a long, deep interest in nuclear energy issues. And I think it may give us a little context that might help tonight. So if we are prepared to show that tape, the person who was going to show it has vanished into the wilderness. Oh, you're here. It may give us a bit of a context.
We have heard tonight about public health and public policy. 31 years after New York fired up its first nuclear power plant, we're still looking for a place to put the radioactive trash they produce.
Deadlocked in Albany, the state legislature has turned its attention back to West Valley, the little village south of Buffalo, with a nuclear dump already in place. We sent Gene Kessler to Cattaraugus County to see how the community is taking the news that most or all of New York's nuclear waste could be heading west to a nuclear valley. Back in the glory days of the atom, Governor Nelson Rockefeller envisioned a nuclear high-tech park. Under his guidance, the state bought 3,000 acres in West Valley, put up a facility to reprocess used nuclear fuel, and established a second area to dump so-called low-level nuclear wastes.
The disposal technology of the 60s were what's called shallow and burial, where waste was buried directly in the ground.
So just back the truck up to the end of the trench and kick it off, or what?
That's pretty much the way it was.
The state remains caretaker of the hodgepodge radioactive trenches, which still show from the air, but have been reworked and covered with tarp.
We've done a lot of work to reduce the amount of water that's gotten into the trenches. We've done work in terms of increasing the thickness of the trench cap, installing barriers.
The state's job has been relatively simple compared to the task the feds took on.
Along with the high-level radioactive waste,
DOE has to get rid of 35 million curies of high-level slurry, debris from chopped up fuel rods stored underground in a tank.
we're dealing here at this project with waste that was here from the 60s and early 70s. We're not bringing waste in, we're not sending waste out, we're not disposing of waste.
The Department of Energy plans to solidify the wastes in glass, still working on the exact technology. As state-of-the-art and foolproof as this may look, nothing has ever been invented that was proven to contain nuclear wastes over the long haul. And we're talking about a long, long time.
In about 700 years, it will be giving off about the same amount of radiation as a naturally occurring uranium ore deposit. So if you isolate it for 700 years, you have a material that is relatively safe.
700 years? That's more than 3 times longer than the U.S. government, which is now responsible for the wastes, has existed. Other garbage stored at West Valley will be dangerous for thousands of years. The low-level dump operated at West Valley for just 12 years. The reprocessing plant only lasted 7 years before the feds moved in and shut them down. The estimated cost to clean up the site is at least $3 billion, and that's for just 12 years of work.
That's really a staggering figure.
That's a lot of money.
Gene, just how badly does New York State need a nuclear waste repository?
Well, in 1991, New York State was the 3rd largest producer of nuclear wastes in the country. There are 360 nuclear waste generators. By far, the biggest producers are the state's 7 nuclear power plants, 3 of them at 9 Mile Point. The others are industries, hospitals, and universities. And here in Onondaga County, we have, I believe it's nine producers of waste, everything from Bristol-Myers to Syracuse University, with Hancock Field thrown in between. Do you realize it's such an issue now? Yeah, you thought it was settled years ago, right? Well, West Valley, there's a law that says it cannot be a nuclear dump site. What happens is the state simply needs one. It has a deadline. The deadline was today to get back to South Carolina, which is where we now take our wastes, and say, we have a plan, don't shut us out. So today the push is on, and perhaps Albany could actually vote on West Valley any moment.
Gene, we know you've done a lengthy investigation into this setup at West Valley. What do you have for us tomorrow night?
Tomorrow night, believe it or not, somebody who actually wants the dump to come to West Valley. He says it will spiff up his town's image and bring in some jobs. Interesting man.
Funny.
Interesting perspective. Sure. Thank you.
So on the Earthwatch, New York is in a bind about nuclear waste and ready to break a promise it made to West Valley back in 1986.
And the state's 360 nuclear waste generators have been told they won't be able to dump nuclear garbage in South Carolina anymore because New York is dragging its feet and opening a dump. While the 2 states hash out the controversy, waste generators are taking steps of their own to find a dumping ground. They're setting sites on West Valley, an open pit while it's wide. Gene Kessler tells us wastes may soon be heading west to an old and new nuclear valley. Chuck Kuchar is a practical man. Companies that make nuclear wastes are willing to pay millions to any town hosting a nuclear dump, and he wants West Valley to take the money.
We were looking at improving the image of the town and improving the facilities of the town, as far as the town building, as far as a library, as far as maybe a golf course.
2 years ago, Kuchar secretly helped write legislation that would bring a new dump in exchange for $4.2 million a year. When residents found out they were livid, but the protests haven't changed Kuchar's mind.
The bill that we have presented will provide that. It's got to be safe and it's got to be environmentally sound.
It comes down to jobs. If a town isn't growing, it's dying. And the West Valley Chamber of Commerce believes by getting a new and expanded nuclear dump, it will ensure a healthy future.
If there is a spill or something, they know exactly what happens, where it goes, and so forth. And they're very, very cautious, and again, the safety and health of the people is going to be number one.
Number two could well be money. The West Valley Coalition says the town has gained thousands just soliciting a dump. Here are the highlights. $67,000 to the volunteer fire department, $19,000 in town legal fees. 2 school districts have been offered a total of $48,000 and thousands in campaign contributions to local politicians. The coalition counts $100,000 in bribes in under a year when what the town ought to be thinking of is the real cost.
But commit future generations to spending something like $100 million a year that we're currently spending is simply not healthy, not sane, not very smart.
Money has succeeded in dividing West Valley against itself. Gene Kessner, 9 News, West Valley. New York isn't alone in being unable to site a nuclear waste dump. So far, 17 states from California to Vermont have tried and failed. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent, but in every case, people want nothing to do with nuclear waste being brought to their town.
Not in my backyard.
That's right.
Only her place.
Mm-hmm. Zimmerman bought this farm in 1943. He's a farmer with a farmer's sense of responsibility, and he has no patience for the nuclear industry.
If I sell milk like I used to from this farm, and if I asked the public to clean up my manure, I'd be out of business so quick you wouldn't know what happened.
He was here 20 years before the nuclear wastes came, and though many longtime West Valley residents are giving up and selling out, he's in the battle and the valley to stay.
As long as I have an ounce of strength to fight it, I'm going to fight it. And that's why we haven't put our place up for sale, and if we did, we probably wouldn't get what it was worth.
The Zimmermans will never leave their home, not unless the dump leaves first. But the people who live in this house can't get out of here fast enough.
And the minute you say it's West Valley, they thank you very much, and after that, like, they hang out.
Their house has been on the market for 2 years. It's everything they ever wanted. They added the pool and the garage after the 1986 law protecting West Valley. Now that the town government is soliciting nuclear waste, the Merritts believe they're stuck.
You can't even leave if you wanted to because there isn't a market to buy your home.
I don't want to live in a town that is willing to take waste for money.
People that are faithful to the nuclear industry and feel that, you know, it's safe and that we need it for our economy and for the energy, they don't live here.
But the Merritts do, and the Zimmermans.
We aren't going to move until we, and if we do get it stopped, why should we move then?
Shut down the nukes before we waste their valley. Gene Kessner, 9 News, West Valley.
Turn the volume down.
I have it turned on.
Oh, that's why.
It wasn't this one.
From your watch today, environmentalists from all across New York State are banding together now to stop the threat to West Valley.
Well, Western New York community is the only one even willing to consider a nuclear dump. Tonight in Heading West Nuclear Valley, Gene Kessler shows us that Albany's target for a waste site will not be an easy target. We've come to a time of reckoning. For half a century, we've been pumping out radioactive waste with no place to put it. Near people, it can cause cancer or birth defects. So who should it be near? Generators prefer to send their trash to other states or country communities like West Valley. Why should you care if the West Valley nuclear dump leaks or will leak? Well, the answer is on your dinner table tonight. This dump drains into a creek that drains into Lake Erie. Lake Erie drains into Lake Ontario. And radioactive tritium from West Valley has already been found in Lake Erie.
You drink Lake Erie water,
And already the existing dumps in West Valley are leaking into the creeks and the brooks, and ultimately the poisons, nuclear poisons, are going into Lake Erie water.
Angie Kyle is one of thousands of people who live outside West Valley but want to protect it. Buffalo Common Council has passed a resolution calling for wastes to be stored at the point of generation. Cortland County has passed a similar resolution. Community after community declaring their land nuclear-free and calling for on-site storage.
Most of New York's radioactive material is more radioactive than high-level military waste.
No, we don't. That's good.
You want to finish it?
No, that's fine.
You ready to finish it? Okay, you have the idea? If all of you had seen that, I apologize to you, except I think it's useful for us to see that series of radioactive waste, so-called low-level radioactive waste disposal, and certainly is dealing at the present time with the issue of sewage sludge, which may contain radioactivity from the nuclear power facilities within the county and from other locations. Having a commonality of knowing what it is that we're talking about. Well, maybe I should ask, does everyone here know what low-level radioactive waste consists of? Are you not too certain? Shirley?
Basically everything except from rad. I mean, I'm getting the idea that it could go from septic right on straight up through to what they use when they treat cancer patients with the pellets and whatnot. I mean, that's what I'm assuming.
Yeah. The question is, what is the range of radioactive materials that are legally categorized as low-level radioactive waste? The federal definition is very inclusive. So we must keep in mind that although the waste is called low-level as a category, in comparison with high-level waste, which is the other major category, one of the other major categories, the category also includes the so-called classes B and C waste that are higher progressively in concentration of activity. And I'm going to be asking you all to do some homework on your own because we don't have time to go through everything tonight. But somebody around here better get an up-to-date copy, mine's a little old, of the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 10, that deals with energy. Because here you will find the regulations for the management of low-level waste that have been promulgated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and which the states are bound to follow in part, if not in whole. So the Class B and C waste may include both very hot materials and long-lived ones. Virtually all the components of a reactor are indeed included in the category of low-level radioactive waste. The piping, the sludges, the resins, the control rods, but not the fuel. The spent reactor fuel is categorized as high-level waste. Even the reactor pressure vessel, and for that matter, the concrete containment, if the plants are ultimately torn down, all are categorized as low-level radioactive waste. Now, some transuranics, some amounts of plutonium in small quantities, 100 nanocuries per gram, as I recall, are allowed in low-level waste. They may be intermingled with other forms of low-level waste. If there is leakage from a fuel rod into the cooling water and contamination subsequently in the surrounding materials, that spent fuel, that portion that leaks out of a fuel rod, if that does occur, then becomes legally low-level waste. Excluded from the category are special nuclear materials, certain source and byproduct materials, uranium mill tailings, and the bulk of the transuranic the bomb-related materials. And those will go into those other categories of high level or of the transuranic waste. For high level waste, the Department of Energy has responsibility and has been attempting to develop a site at Yucca Mountain. What is of significance for our concern about low level waste with that facility is that the Department of Energy under federal law started out to evaluate carefully a number of sites, about half a dozen in the west, and a whole clutch of them in the east. There's one up around Fort Drum in New York State, in Vermont, in Michigan, in Minnesota, in Maine, New Hampshire, my state of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Virginia, North Carolina, way back in the mid-1960s, about 8 years ago. The political fallout of the effort to cite 2 national repositories for high-level waste, the spent fuel, with millions upon millions of curies of activity. The fallout led the Congress to go into what I think I would call a full retreat. And in 1987, they amended the law that deals with high-level waste to designate one of those sites that were the numerous ones under consideration. And the unlucky congressional delegation that was the weakest was that of Nevada. And hence, with the Nevada test site already in the state and a strong nuclear industry there, it became the designated site. Now, in addition to high-level transuranic, so-called low-level, there are also other categories of radioactive waste, the so-called mixed wastes, which are both radioactive and hazardous, but they are a low-level waste responsibility. When we try to decontaminate radioactive equipment materials so that perhaps they can be recycled, used again, waste will be generated by removing the scraping off the surface activity or using solvents to remove it, and those solvents mixed with radioactivity, you see, are likely to be classified as mixed waste. The Department of Energy at its weapons facilities has an enormous amount of mixed waste, I'm told. And it is a particular problem, both because it's difficult to handle, being both hazardous waste and radioactive, and also because it is regulated under 2 agencies that don't always necessarily see eye to eye. Then there is a category that is called greater than Class C. And that brings us back to the low-level waste category, because legally that's low-level waste, but it is the waste which the Nuclear Regulatory Commission may designate as too radioactive to go into a low-level waste site, and so they turn it over to the Department of Energy. Well, DOE has been, as I understand it, kind of dragging its feet about taking those wastes and deciding where they're going to put them, what they're going to do with them. The whole waste program, you see, is in a terrible jumble. In order to reduce the costs of management for the so-called low-level waste category, about, 1985, the Congress directed the Nuclear Regulatory Commission also to establish a category that they called below regulatory concern. And that was to be essentially the Class A waste, about 30 to 40% of the total volume of low-level waste, which would be removed from the low-level waste category and redesignated as below regulatory concern. Means just that. The NRC would no longer regulate it, and the generators would be free to send it out in a dumpster to a municipal landfill, either nearby or a long way away, or to dump the liquids into sewage systems, or to sell off the contaminated materials for reuse, recycle into a whole range of consumer products. And in fact, way back in the late 70s, beginning of the 80s, the NRC had developed a whole environmental impact statement on the doses people would receive if contaminated metals were recycled into, building materials, furniture, the infamous cast iron cooking skillet, jewelry, children's toys, coins in the pocket, all kinds of consumer products. Because of citizen action throughout the country, the Congress backed away and required the NRC to revoke that below regulatory concern policy. However, it's still on the books in the low-level waste policy law of 1985, and the NRC is able to, not to deregulate directly as BRC, below regulatory concern, but rather to use various means within the licensing and regulatory process to do the same thing, to declare that certain materials, certain processes are no longer under regulatory control, to exempt a licensee from reporting requirements or regulatory requirements. And hence we find in the case of concern in Volney that radioactive material that has not been designated as waste is allowed to be exempted from regulatory control. And what has come to the Bristol Hill landfill then would be from the non-nuclear side of the facility, wash water, human wastes, and what is called dermal waste. I've talked to one engineer, when I said, well, I'm assuming that means the scrubbings from the skin, dermal skin. And he said, well, in engineering practice, we sometimes use that term to refer to the external contaminants on equipment, on metals and so forth. So how that term is used, I cannot specifically say, and I think it's a good question for you to get an answer to from the DEC and from the licensees as well. That's more than you needed to know about what low-level waste is, isn't it, or is it? Well, no, because I need to come back to another point. Yes, question?
You're familiar with New York State siting process, right, the low-level siting?
Yes.
They're looking for a site for all three, A, B, and C, is that correct?
Yes. Yes, the question is New York State looking for a site for Class A, Class B, and Class C waste? And to my knowledge, yes, they are. Yes, sir.
What happens with the uniforms that the people work there, the cover on, and when they bathe themselves and wash themselves, what happens to that water? Does that go into the regular sewage system?
To the best of my knowledge, this varies from one plant to another, but if a plant has its own sewage system, it's my understanding that those materials would go, the wastewater would go into that sewage system, become the septage and so forth, and then in turn be the material that is sent off to, in your case, the Minetto sewage treatment facility. In some other plants, it may be handled differently. There are also nuclear laundries in a number of states. There's a company that has operated a nuclear laundry in Massachusetts near Springfield, one near the nuclear power plant, the Limerick plant in Pennsylvania near Philadelphia, another one near Pittsburgh, and those are the ones that I'm personally acquainted with, but there are many others in the country that will do the laundering for the licensees. And those facilities, in turn, are permitted a release. Now, it's important to understand that there are a number of regulated categories of exposure to members of the public as well as to workers. And the exposure limits, I think, are important for us to be a little bit acquainted with. You want me to go through those kind of quickly so you get a sense of them? Naturally occurring background. Oh boy, can you see this? Naturally occurring background exposure is on the order of 80 to 100 or at high elevations or on a radioactive bedrock around 200 millirem, or thousandths of a rem, to use the old category that I'm familiar with better, per year. And that's what we get from cosmic sources, from the ground beneath our feet, from tiny traces maybe in the food we eat, okay? And that's what we have evolved with over eons of time, all right? Roughly 100 millirem is what I consider to be background naturally occurring. But you need to understand that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission now has a different definition in its regulatory standards. And they no longer talk about naturally occurring background, they just talk about background. And so background includes what? Fallout from atmospheric nuclear testing. Well, that ended, what, 1963? 30 years is the half-life of cesium. We're now at 1994. We have just gone through the first half-life of the cesium-137 and a little over the first half-life of the strontium-90 that was released in that long period of the 1950s and early 60s from atmospheric nuclear testing. The first half-life. So that stuff's still sort of floating around in small amounts, and it's a small contributor. They estimate maybe 5 additional millirem, but that will vary from place to place around the country. So background now is thought to include the fallout, to include the emissions from previous years of operations of nuclear facilities, and to include the wastes, the releases that have resulted from accidents at nuclear facilities. So, in truth, we'd have a little bit of Chernobyl in the background here as well as in a lot of other places, a little bit. Now, because also of the problem of indoor radon gas, the federal government estimates that about 200 additional millirem are experienced by people whose houses are radon, oh dear, radon rich. And so now they are saying that that background is 300 to 400 millirem per year, with an average figure of 360 millirem per year. Now, with due respect to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in the anecdotal monitoring I've done around the country, from coast to coast and north to south, I don't find anything like that. Only when I get up above 10,000 feet in the Sierras and the Rockies do I find anything like a count that would come out to be that sort of level. Yes?
We had a little talk from 9 months at the Packard County legislature a month ago, and they were giving us all these details on how, my God, wood ash is more radioactive than the cobalt and everything. I mean, we should be worried more about wood ash. What's your feeling on that?
It is my understanding that there is a certain amount of radioactivity that has been picked up in woody plants, that is in the trees, and that it probably comes mostly from fallout and from these other sources over time built into the trees. And that's a very good example of the kind of concern, namely that residual low levels of radioactivity will enter the plant kingdom, hence the food chain, and hence become available to human beings. Well, wood ash, well, after all, there's radioactivity and a certain amount of uranium in coal, or some radium in some coal, and so there is some emission there from coal-fired plants as well. So there are these many, many small additive sources that are not taken into account additively or cumulatively, you see, to which we're all exposed. Then we have medical exposures, and those are said to average on the order of another 100 millirem per year, average. The power plants are permitted to release up to, well, the new regulations say 100 millirem per year, but the next section says that with permission from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they can go up to the old figure of 500 millirem per year to the person who is maximally exposed around a plant. So you see, if we really, and then there are some industrial resources, or industrial sources. Interestingly, increasingly concern about members of the public who are exposed to medical patients who have been treated with nuclear medicine and come home highly radioactive for a few days. They tend to be short-lived. But of course, the NRC now has had a petition to shorten the hospital stay time. So what I'm suggesting here is that we are, each of us, exposed to multiple sources that are additive, that are cumulative, and are synergistic or potentially synergistic with other pollutants. Yes? Oh dear. Well, I suspect that, what is it you eat bananas for? Potassium? A little bit, probably. I would suspect it is less and far less from a banana than it is from at least some of the sewage sludge. Probably not all, certainly. We hope not all. Look, there are many sources that contribute to that total dose that we get from the naturally occurring sources. But what we're concerned with here are the additive quantities that come from the human activities that generate radioactive materials and radioactive waste. And that is where we get this addition over which individuals have no control in terms of the exposure, nor any means of knowing about their exposure. And I feel certainly that that element of individual choice is of very major significance. In fact, our radiation protection standards supposedly were set on the basis that the individual would receive a benefit from each exposure commensurate with the risk. However, the existing standards are based on the assumption that the societal benefit from the uses of nuclear energy, industrial, for electricity, for medicine, all the others, outweigh the risk to individuals. And that's fine, unless you happen to be the individual who has the risk that in turn leads to the damage. And that takes me to the nature of the damage. And I'll try to be real brief about that one, because I know I've talked with a number of you before, and for those of you who are very familiar with all this, I do apologize for the elementary level of it. Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm. Definitely is a problem. I think one of the things that I would like to know is the average age, I think, for mankind, I guess, is around 72 for a man. I don't know what it is for a woman.
We get to stick around a little longer.
But, how many milligrams does it take to affect the human body?
How many millirems does it take to affect the human body? Okay.
We have so many different elements today that's carcinogenic.
That's right.
It has nothing to do with milligrams.
Yeah, his question is, what does it take to affect a human body from ionizing radiation? And how does that relate to all the other carcinogenic agents to which we are exposed, and the whole host of pollutants in our environment, not to mention our lifestyles that add their own contribution. Well, in the past, we set our radiation standards based on our observations of what were expected to be the consequences of exposure. And for many years, because we were not able to observe low-dose effects, it had been assumed that there was a threshold of exposure below which there would be no damage. And the standards were set in part on the assumption of that threshold of injury. And at the same time, if we look back into the older literature, we go back to the Nobel Prize winner, Hermann Müller, in the 40s, 50s, who did the original research work on mutation and fruit flies. We find that it was well understood that there was indeed risk associated with all levels of exposure, including the naturally occurring background levels. Not everybody would die from a natural background level, of course, but there would be a randomness of the distribution, and it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to determine whose spontaneous cancer came from a naturally occurring background source of radiation or from some other pollutant. It would be very difficult to determine whether the genetic defect in a child, whether it's a physical defect or mental retardation, was resultant from that source or some other. But what was understood is that every exposure carried a risk. It was thought that there were on the order of 20,000 spontaneous cancer deaths per year within the U.S. population many years ago from the naturally occurring sources. And it was also understood that for every positive mutation in our species, that is, an adaptation to the environment that we live in, there would also be many genetic errors, mistakes. And those genetic mistakes express themselves how? As damaged human beings. Possibly spontaneously aborted, they never come to fruition as a baby, or they do and live out their lives, which may be shortened radically. They may or may not be able to contribute to the society that supports them. They may live very damaged lives. And those, you see, are the other side of the evolutionary process. So, nonetheless, the experts in this field, in radiation health physics, set standards that were designed under federal law, the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, 40 years old, set standards that would allow the operation of a nuclear industry to which the U.S. Congress had committed us in the program of Dwight David Eisenhower called Atoms for Peace. That goes clear back to the 50s. But at that time, we didn't understand what now has come to be much better understood concerning the impacts of low-dose radiation exposure. And here we have seen in the field of molecular radiation biology, in the fields of epidemiology, and in other fields of biological research, a much clearer understanding both of the processes of the damage, of the mutational effect, and a better comprehension of the consequences. Every hit, every radiation impact, whether it's on the little monitor or on the body of each of you in here, constantly going on, may or may not cause a transfer of energy into the nucleus of one of the cells in your body. Now, let me quote the way it's put that I find most arresting. In the past, we assumed we were talking about cancer, leukemia, and genetic defects. What now is recognized is that there is also a large range of non-cancer impacts from low-dose radiation. Well, from any radiation exposures. And here is the way it is put by a medical doctor writing for his colleagues. Ionizing radiation will target only a part of any one of the billions of atoms in a single cell. Its energy is dispersed unevenly among many atoms of any of the approximately 75 trillion cells in the human body. No two people or even comparable DNA segments of any two cells can receive the same dose of ionizing radiation. Much molecular damage is done by ionizing radiation before the symptoms can be recognized. So, from the kind of work in which medical people have begun to look at the non-cancer impacts at low doses, and I think even more importantly from the research that has gone on in the former Soviet Union in the aftermath of Chernobyl, they have now determined pretty conclusively that the low-dose exposures, when they are chronically received, slightly radioactive food, slightly radioactive water, the occasional radioactive particle breathed in, that those impacts internally through ingestion and inhalation have a very different set of effects. They don't necessarily cause cancer, but what they do is interfere with the functioning of the immune system. The head of radiation biology for the former Soviet Academy of Sciences put it this way: after the research that they have done following Chernobyl, in both observations of the children particularly, because they're rapidly growing and it's a much more effective mechanism of change for them, and laboratory research, what they find is that this chronic low-dose exposure interferes enough with the immune system that the recipient then is more susceptible to infections, to all the normal diseases of childhood. Dr. Boardman, the author of this physician's guide, says radiation isn't linked with any specific kind of disease or illness, doesn't cause any particular disease, but it becomes then a factor in allowing other diseases to occupy the human body. And the observations certainly in the former Soviet Union are leading to, says Dr. Berlikova, a rewriting of classical radiation biology, because our standards do not take into account those low-dose, non-cancer, non-fatal effects. Does that long-windedly respond to your question?
Well, I'm looking at the immediate impact, within my life cycle, and I've lived through the asbestos era.
Sure.
I'm in my 60s, and
Yeah.
I think I'm pretty healthy.
Congratulations.
I can just say that this low-level waste that we're talking about, we certainly want to address it and to find a way to contain it. But on the other hand, rather than alarm the people, I would like to try to find out what really near future impact it has on the human body. When I say the average age is around 72.
Has been around 72. Let me ask you to consider this. How many of you, well, if you don't want to answer, you don't have to. How many of you were born before 1952? Oh, aren't we honest? Consider this. We are of the last generation to have been born, conceived, grown, been born, grown up through those critical childhood years, in the absence of the additive amounts of ionizing radiation, and in the absence of a great many of the chemical pollutants, better living through chemistry, remember? Of the chemical pollutants that are now found pervasively in the environment, in the biosystem. Those who were born during the period, who were conceived, carried, and born during the period of atmospheric nuclear testing have had a very different experience. And certainly those who would receive radiation exposures from other sources as well. One of the most respected medical doctors in this field is the British epidemiologist, Dr. Alice Stewart. Some of you are familiar with her work? Dr. Stewart was the first to identify in the 1950s that a single pelvic X-ray administered to a pregnant woman in the last trimester before the baby was born, to know its position and so forth, that single X-ray would double the probability of cancer, or of leukemia, rather, in the child. And wise doctors, of course, no longer use a pelvic X-ray. Certainly, if they can avoid it, they don't. Now, Dr. Stewart's work went on to say this, and some of you have heard this before, and I apologize to you, but I think this is so very vital to our understanding. She has hypothesized that very few things really get into that nice, secure place where the embryo and fetus exist for 9 months. But one of them that does penetrate is ionizing radiation, gamma radiation, from bedrock. And the British had done some very detailed research that showed the levels of background radiation from terrestrial gamma sources. And she was able then to do the research that compared those levels with the incidence of childhood cancer and leukemia in Britain over a period of time, a number of years, several decades in fact. And after statistically they sorted out and eliminated the social and economic differences, they were left with a very strong positive correlation between that background, the high background radiation levels and the higher incidence of childhood cancer and leukemia deaths. And here's her reasoning. The embryo, particularly during early development, receives this gamma exposure sufficient to cause that minor disruption, possibly initiating a cancer which would take a number of years, for 7 to 10 years for leukemia, 10, 20 years or more for a solid tumor, to develop in the child, but also would damage the immune system of that developing embryo and fetus. The baby would be born appearing to be healthy, but the child was in fact weakened, such that those were the children who, exposed to infectious diseases of childhood, would be the ones more likely to drop out of the population, not to make it. It's called a competing cause of death. So the infectious diseases of childhood affecting those children more than others would cause or could cause their dropping out of the population early, before the expiration of that latency period. Now, back in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, we started using a lot of antibiotics. We pulled the kids through. We used vaccines so they didn't get some of those diseases. And those children, even if they were damaged, would live through that early period. Now, what Dr. Stewart was really saying is probably that kind of very subtle early damage had been going on through our evolutionary period historically. But we never saw it before until now we're able to pull those kids through the early diseases. They live long enough to develop the cancers and leukemias. Now, I consider this very serious. I do not intend nor try to alarm anyone. And in fact, I will tell you, having devoted 25 years of my life, virtually all of it pro bono publico, how's your Latin? For the public good. That means without payment. To attempting to assist people to understand the nature of the problem of ionizing radiation, I don't think it is appropriate that that term alarmist should be applied, because I'm deeply dedicated to the management of radioactive waste, that it be kept out of the biosystem, because once loose in the biosystem, there are many pathways for it to travel. And all of the techniques of management of what we call disposal. Tell me when you last disposed of anything. Anything. No, you didn't dispose of anything in the bathroom. Where did it go? Well, we won't get so graphic and personal, maybe. But no, we never dispose of anything, do we? We change its form, maybe. We change its location, right? We have to await the physical decay of unstable matter. It's going to be around. We can't neutralize it chemically. It's going to be there. And the more of it there is in the biosystem, in addition to that naturally occurring background level in which we evolved, the more consequence there will be in terms of human health. And if we want to put this in a rather crass term, that consequence expresses itself in very expensive health. Environment. Okay. And I need to add one other thing about this. Bear in mind that the development of nuclear energy in the United States and in the former Soviet Union was a military development for national security, so we were told. And for any of us who have studied the history of the atomic age and know the laws that govern nuclear energy, we are well aware that members of the public have not had full access to information concerning the effects of ionizing radiation. Even when it's been known, it's been very difficult even for physicians to get the literature, to get their hands on and get a handle on. And of course, it's very difficult to do the kind of scientific research that is recognized in our society today. Doesn't mean that the damage doesn't occur. If you don't look, you're not going to see. We're looking now, and what we're finding is that the problem is very substantially greater than had been previously understood. And even the International Commission on Radiological Protection is taking measures to reduce permissible levels of exposure to members of the public as well as workers worldwide. Our Nuclear Regulatory Commission has been unwilling to take into account these low-dose and chronic low-dose effects. Yeah, a couple of questions. I'm sorry. Lots of them. Yeah. Yes, clear at the back. Well, folks, what do we do with it? Now, let's think about this very carefully. Had we halted the construction of nuclear power plants in the United States in the early 1970s, we would have a tiny fraction of the amount of commercial radioactive waste we have today. But we didn't. And so long as the facilities that are the principal generators go on generating, there will be more and more and more. Control over any of it. The more expensive it becomes. Some of you have heard me use this figure before, I think, at a conference last fall at MIT. The conferees, it was on the future of advanced nuclear reactors, and the conferees kept talking about the T word. The T word that was the real concern. The T word turned out to be it meant $1.1 trillion. Now that adds 25% onto the national debt. That's roughly $4,000 for each man, woman, and child in the nation, in addition to the, 15, 16, 18, it's going up daily, indebtedness that each man, woman, and newborn baby already has. Okay? So that's coming back to your question of what are we going to do? Yeah, just a little minute, okay?
Take a moment and have Mark Lichtenstein just give people a quick rundown of where the county is in the process and what they're doing right now.
Okay, and then I'll come back to that question because we need to think carefully about promoting the waste going to whose backyard. Is there an answer to it? Yeah, I think there is, and I think you've heard the first stage of that answer in the response, or in the response to my question. I think we've arrived at the point where we've got to cut. We kind of got to cut our losses because we don't know that we're going to be able to dispose of these wastes. And it becomes increasingly apparent that we may not. That being the case, the first step is to know how much we have to deal with. So I think it's going to be very important to understand for Oswego County, certainly, what those sources are. And I think we do somebody has produced the slides. Yes, sir?
Are you telling us that we should become aware that we are going to have to store the waste in Oswego County, as we have been doing at this site out here in Fremont, as we've been forced to do? As we've been told we're going to have to keep the waste in Volney? Is that what you're telling us?
No, sir. I am not saying that.
In other words, you're saying that we can get rid of it, get it out of our town?
No, I'm not saying that either.
What are you saying?
Think hard. Is it right for you to say it's okay to take it to somebody else's backyard?
Positively. Cortland did it. We should do the same thing. And pretty soon shut
Well,
them down.
So long as every place says we don't want it,
right. Then you shut it
what's
down.
going to happen?
You shut them down. That's it.
All right, that sounds good, but I'm going to go on here because that's raising a very complex aspect of this issue, and that is who controls what, politically and in the regulatory realm.
The people control.
Oh, excuse me.
And told them
Excuse me. In that earliest stage of the low-level waste battle in the state of New York, there was a magnificent response on the part of the people whose homes were threatened, whose land was threatened. And I think the nation learned a lot. And certainly New York's politicians did as well. I cannot imagine that any of those people think it's okay to send the waste to West Valley, a site that's already leaking. Do they? No. Now,
Can we let somebody else?
wait a minute. Because the alternatives of sending our waste where we had been sending it, to Barnwell, are now closed off. And the only method at the moment is on-site storage at the site of generation. And in the past, I think a lot of us had felt that that was going to be the, indelicately put, the constipation factor that would force the industry to say, well, okay, we'd better generate waste or generate electricity some other way. But now we have to consider who controls what. The state has the authority over waste management. But who generates the waste? Who generates the waste? The nuclear power plants. Well,
We'll use the power to take the waste.
yeah. Oh, I know you did. I lived up in Oswego at the time 9 Mile Point was first under consideration. Believe me, I know there were people who didn't want it. But I'm trying to find the number here, and I think I've lost it. By county, Oswego, shipped. Oswego
County creates of nuclear waste.
number of generators reporting in Oswego County are 5. The number of generators who ship low-level waste are 3, this says. The volume of the waste from Oswego County, 64,767 cubic feet. Percent of the total in the state of New York, this is a couple of years ago, 58%. The activity, the Curies, 102,083. The percent of the total number of Curies shipped in the state of New York, 99.0. This is where the waste is generated. But is it right for the waste to remain? For those who are living with power plants, we hope they're going to operate safely. On-site storage means the following. According to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission staff, this past week, in meeting with the state regulators, number 1, NRC will not condone on-site storage. They withdrew their policy statement last April. The NRC is pushing for the states and the generators to accelerate the development of a new facility in each of the host states. The NRC staff said, here are some of the problems we're facing, however, as a result of on-site storage. Degradation of the containers, inability to stabilize the waste because the generator doesn't know what the final form of that waste is likely to be wherever finally it ends up. Fire protection is a major factor of concern to the NRC. Increasing doses to both workers and members of the public in the vicinity of the generating facilities. Incineration of low-level radioactive waste, and increased authorized releases up to the maximum permitted under regulations. And that's where we tie back to the potential for increased amounts of low-level waste, or what is actually called radioactive material, entering the exempt category and the shipments that go through the sewage treatment facility and end up in your landfill. So because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has the preemptive authority, it regulates what happens at the reactor, not the state of New York. And that's where we're running into trouble. And if you have some more questions, and if I have a chance to talk some more about this, I'm going to talk about the shift in the regulatory process of the NRC. 2 in particular. Exercise of discretion not to enforce license conditions. And secondly, elimination of requirements, regulatory requirements deemed marginal to safety. That's the direction that we see the NRC moving in its regulatory control over the generators of the waste, the utility reactors. And that's why I think we're facing a very serious problem wherever we end up with this waste material.
Okay.
I apologize for going on through that.
Okay. Now I'd like to introduce Mark Lichtenstein, Deputy Superintendent of Solid Waste for the county, and he can give you a quick overview of what the county's position is and where we are, and then if you want to ask him some questions, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer you.
Well, one of the things I was going to do was introduce the legislators, but that was already done, so I won't go through all that again. And I know everybody's pretty tired. Basically, the county legislature met last Thursday and passed 2 resolutions, and any legislators here want to add anything to what I'm saying, just go ahead and do that. But 2 resolutions were passed, and the resolution is the form of when they make basically law at the legislative body. One was that we would reaffirm our local law because we have a local law that says we will not accept radioactive waste. Now, the interesting point, I think, is that it just dawned on me, which has been said for a while, but this BRC, below regulatory concern, that's the way it's written in our law. But basically there was linguistic changes because the terminology that the utility use are radioactive material to get around the law. Okay. But still, the legislature voted on it and reaffirmed the local law saying that we will not take any radioactive material in our landfill. The second resolution, which I think is the most important one, and they're up here, by the way, Legislator Tabor had a copy here, so I'm sure that we can show it to you. Maybe I can make some copies or whatever. The second one is that we want to be lead agency on this, and that's another technical. Not, it was pretty close to it. So what does that mean? That means that we have to take over this whole process, that we're the ones that the utilities, if we get lead agency, and that's a big if. Let me explain to you what happens on the 25th. The DEC will get a letter from the county saying we want to take over this whole process. The DEC then is in direct conflict with us. There are 2 agencies that want lead agency status. Now, who makes the decision? The commissioner of the DEC in Albany. Okay?
The town of Volney has voted to support you in your bid, however.
Okay, so Langdon Marsh has 12 days from the 25th to make this decision. That's the way it is in the law. Now, you and I both know that he's going to vote in favor of the DEC. On the outside chance he doesn't do that, then we would take it over, and we would have to request, let's just take this process further, we would probably end up requesting environmental impact statements from the utilities, and this thing would get to be long drawn out. We'd have public meetings. But the bottom line is the county does not want the material in the landfill. Somebody had asked me, well, how are you going to stop it if the DEC says it's okay? I mean, it's fine for you to say no. And I basically said to them, this is where we could get into some discussion, and I'd like to answer some questions. The county, in solid waste laws, the county can pass stricter regulations than the state can. We've done it. I'll give you an example. If you have a gas station, you have to take the gas tank out of the ground and some of the soil has been contaminated with gasoline. It's called oil-soaked debris. Legally, it's okay for us to take that material at the landfill. That's something that's considered solid waste and can go in our landfill. But it's something that our county passed a rule on saying we will not take that material because we don't want the oil to get into our leachate because that's technically a hazardous material, benzene, toluene. That's stricter than the state regulations. And the interesting thing is, plenty of people come to us. They'll even drive right up there with a dump truck load of this stuff and ask to dump it, and we'll turn them away. And they'll say they called the DEC, and the DEC said it was okay to take it here. So we get into this conflict with them all the time. Even the conservation officers have come down and asked, why aren't you taking the material? So now we have radioactive material or sludge, and we say no to it. So then what's going to happen? The DEC says yes. Can they make us take it? I don't know. What do you think? Can they make us take it?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely positively not.
Marie?
He stated, hey, the county could stop this tomorrow. They operate that landfill. All they had to do was tell us they don't want it anymore.
He said that.
Put on tape if you want that.
Just like Cortland said, they didn't
Okay.
want the low-level waste dump down.
I think maybe I was talking to Cindy at one point when she asked me what we would do. Well, I'll tell you what I do. I'll tell it, and it'll be broadcast around the city. We'd shut the gates at the landfill and make them drive the bulldozers. I mean, my employees are not going to do what, if I tell them not to do it, but then that would mean you aren't going to get rid of your trash either, and we're going to have to find a place to get rid of the trash. But I know the legislators would support that. If it ever came down to it, I can't see the DEC coming to our legislature and saying, you will take this or that or the other thing. I mean, I don't think these legislators here would really, that would be too favorable for them. So, but we have the key to the gate. Now, maybe they can make us open it up. I don't know.
That sludge, that processed material is coming from the meadow.
Right.
It's not coming directly from Scriba. So if you're turning away material that's been processed at Minetto, so you're turning away all of Minetto's sludge. So where it's got to stop is at Minetto.
Right, I don't want to, can you hear me in the back? That microphone was kind of, yeah, you're right. Basically, we've already told Minetto that. Even before the legislature met on Thursday, we told them we will not take your material. We will not take it. So then, that's in Minetto's ballpark. I don't know what they're going to do. But they have the ability there. One of the things you have to understand is this material that's coming from the nuclear power plants is not sludge, it's liquid. It's basically septage. There's a difference, septage and sludge. Septage is what you'd find in your septic tank if you were to open it up and look in there. That's what this material is. And it is from the non-nuclear areas. It's from the dermal, and again, I'll check into what they mean by dermal, but I understood it, and they specifically said it'd be when an employee comes out of the nuclear part of the plant, they would walk over through the monitors, the radiation monitors, walk over sticky pads. There's a sticky pad on the floor like fly paper to get anything off the bottom of their shoes. And they would go into the locker room, and they would take a shower, and so this would be, maybe there'd be particles still on their body. It would go down in, go into the bathroom. But mostly they said it was from the dermal. That's where it's from. And it goes into their sewage treatment plant. Pasney has one, and the 2 9-mile plants go in one, so there's 2 up there. It goes into their sewage treatment process, and they have bacteria and everything, and then a sludge is created, a septage, and that gets shipped in tanker trucks to Minetto. Similar to the septic tank pumping companies you might see drive down the street up in Pulaski, Krebs septic tank pumping. There's a guy who does that for nuclear plants. Goes into Minetto and gets mixed in with all the stuff from the houses. They take other things from other places. The septic tank companies bring the stuff there. Then a sludge is created. So one of the things Minetto can do, they could do, is they could separate the 2 out and still take the material from the plants if they chose to do that. Then they would have the non-utility stuff and the utility stuff. That would bring their volume down. Remember, we're only taking a couple hundred tons a year of this stuff. That's one thing they could do, and try to find a home for it somewhere else. Or they could say no and not take it at all, and then the nuclear plants would have to find a home for it.
I was just going to say, why don't the people of Minetto just say, no, we won't take it either?
I can answer that, because Minetto's making over $87,000 a year by taking in the sludge. Gross. And they're not going to stop it
People of Minetto been allowed to
until...
vote on that?
No, we are not.
Well, why can't you vote on that? You must have county legislators, or
We do.
town legislators like ours.
We do, in fact, we have one in the back of the room. You could ask him, Mr. Nicoli.
You're being bought for $87,000 to accept a sludge? They wouldn't buy it for Volney, I know that. It's going to be kept out of Volney, that's for sure.
I have a question on another topic. When the law says that the county, the landfill won't accept any radioactive material, right? Now, we've had a couple meetings on it. Now, what would the basis be? How you determine what's radioactive or not?
Right. And can I answer?
You know, like what you're
Right.
running at the plant, the burner there.
Right.
I'm sure that if you really tested that, that'd probably be more
Yeah.
radioactive than the sludge.
Yeah, let me answer it with a question to Dr. Johnsrud. This is the part of this that I've had a problem with. In my mind, I've separated this into 2 issues: the potential health effects of this particular material, And the other part of it is the precedent that it may set for us for other material in the future, the other low level. The health part of it, I've been back and forth on, quite frankly. It's so low and all that. I've gone through various things in my own mind. The other side of it, I've always felt strongly on that if we take this particular material, and you can define it as detectable radiation from nuclear power, that's how you could define it. If we take detectable radioactive material from the nuclear industry, would we then be setting ourselves up at our landfill, setting a precedent, what they call regulatory creep? Same thing happened at Silk Road, where years ago they said it was okay to take certain materials in there, then the regulations changed and it became a hazardous waste site. Nobody can guarantee us the same thing won't happen to the landfill, and that's my ultimate responsibility, is to keep this landfill going as long as possible. So that alone, I think, is the biggest reason why the legislators don't want it there, because it sets a precedence. On the health issue, I want to ask a question. I think what you were saying, to try to just paraphrase it, is that there is radiation in the environment. You answered that there is some in bananas, there is some in wood ashes, but those items are choices we make as individuals. What we should do is, where we can make a decision to stop adding to that, is that what you're saying? So in this particular case, we have the ability to decide not to take this other very minute amount because it just keeps adding up. Is that?
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the answer to your question.
Nobody is adding up the total, and that is a very deep concern. EPA doesn't do it, NRC doesn't do it. They have their models that determine the supposed doses, but how do you know what dose you're getting? And the relationship with all the other pollutants.
Okay, these guys have had their hands up, but I want to just follow up on that, because I want to tell you right now, we could go and buy a, what do they call it, a spectrometer, not the portal, I'm talking about the one the utility uses, which traces the atoms, the trail of atoms. We could buy one of those for $250,000, put it out at the front of the landfill, and everything that comes in there, in my opinion, will be detectable. Okay? And then what do? Or we can test our leachate. I'm sure we'll find radiation in the leachate. Depends on what kind of isotope it is and what type it is. Because there is stuff in our trash that's got radiation in it, bricks. So we have to make some kind of determination, and I believe that determination is any detectable amount from the nuclear generating industry is the way to say it. Because we would not have been able to detect this if we had a portal monitor out there. It's so low. You had your hand up for a while.
You know, what I'm hearing is a lot of technical talk and a lot of things going on. And this fellow up here said Portland got rid of the dump. Well, we got rid of the dump too, though. We really did. I'll tell you. And it was a statewide effort. It was a statewide effort, as Mrs. Johnson said. When it first started out, it was beautiful. We said not in anybody's backyard. We said it in Oswego County, we said it in Portland, we said it in Allegheny, we said it all over. We said not in anybody's backyard, not in West Valley, not anywhere. And that worked. It only worked because we were local, we were vocal, and that was the key. Mark knows it. Everybody in this room should know it, if they were around then.
Well,
just a handful of people going to Albany, getting in these people's face. Now you say Minetto doesn't have to accept it. You're right, they don't have to accept it.
They take
You're
$87,000
fools
and send us the sludge.
And if these people, these people in this room went down there and picketed your town board meeting,
I think we ought to.
you'd accept it very long.
I think,
now,
you know.
I've been inactive for 3 years, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to get active again.
About time.
And you better look out, because I'm going to be in all your faces. Good, every one of you.
Good.
And just like I told the siting commission, that siting commission down there has been taking money out of your taxpayers' pockets for years.
Yeah, I just did.
That siting commission has sat
I'll say it
there
again.
and filled their pockets and sat back and laughed at you people. Now it's coming back to haunt you.
Fred,
Yes, that stuff
Fred.
that is made out there should be stored on site. It shouldn't go in anybody's backyard until the federal government does something about it. Not the state government, not the local government, but the federal government is where it belongs. Where it always was until they didn't need us anymore, us power plants. Okay? Now, let me go a little bit further. You people all sit up here, some of you even work for Niagara Mohawk, I'm sure. And that's fine, but now they're kind of putting it to you, aren't they? Huh? They're putting it to all of us. And it's time to quit it. It's time to stop it. And the only way you do it is be vocal. You go to that county legislators meeting and you say, under no circumstances are we going to accept this crap.
Wait a minute. We already have done that.
I know that.
So far the meeting's been extremely civil and everything, and I think what we need to do is get all the facts.
It's time to...
Well, I know, and you know, I was right there by your side that whole time, so I know exactly what you're talking about. But this gentleman wanted me to say something on the record again. The county will not take this material from Minetto. It's already been voted on.
But what's to keep the state from passing a law to say, hey, we want that land? They can take it. Mrs. Johnson had said the state is in charge of waste.
The fact.
They can come in and take that
Wait a
land.
minute, Mark, you said we won't take this material. When did we stop? Because we've been taking this material for some time.
No, let me explain that. The Minetto sludge, it's a very small amount of sludge, a couple hundred tons a year. It only comes in the summertime. Okay, ever since they've been there, it comes from June to end of September. So the last time that this landfill took it was I can't remember the specific month, but at least by last September. In November is when we found out about it, when Gene Kessner and Howard and Christine Rose came to the landfill and told us about it. Gene Kessner told us about it because she got records from the state. So immediately we told Minetto we would not take this till we got clarification of the issue. Now it's the summertime, and they probably have sludge to dispose of, if not very close to having sludge to dispose of. And to be honest with you, we're going to try to help the town of Minetto. We've already made the statement that we don't want them to be out there either trying to deal with this alone. We've made that statement, so we'll do what we can to help them.
But they've got this material, you're ready to close the gate to them.
It has been closed.
Okay, it
has been closed, right.
And like this lady says here, they're stockpiling it, maybe in hopes that the DEC will crash through the gates or whatever.
Let's wait a minute. We're starting to go over and make speculation. They aren't. I don't know that they're stockpiling it. The process there is that the sludge goes into drying beds.
This lady says they are.
Yeah, it's drying beds. It's not a big, huge pile that they're waiting to get rid of.
We're not sending it to the landfill, so it is piling up in the
Eventually.
We're not sending it
Right.
anywhere else.
And collecting the $87,000.
Yeah.
Okay, before it gets too late and some people start leaving, we are also lucky to have Ron Scridato, who's the head of the research center, in the audience, and he has some slides that he wants to share with us before people get too tired and leave. We will be able to get back to some of these other questions in just a minute. Ron?
Can I ask
Oh, I should.
Mark, I have a question. We heard how much Minetto was paid. How much were we paid when it went to our land?
nothing?
Well, yeah, there was tipping fees on it. $50 a ton.
$50, $87,000 is what
Yeah.
they got. Where's that?
Pardon? Yeah.
$87,000.
So, I don't know, something like that. I don't.
They got the sludge for permanent disposal.
Right. So multiply 50 times what? $200, whatever that is.
That's to the county.
That's to the county,
That
right?
is to the
That's to the county.
The town of Volney
I have a
gets
question.
nothing.
A lot of people are here to orchestrate a defense against this and any other waste at the nuclear power plant staying here.
Yeah, let's split the issues up. Okay,
We're
we got to.
orchestrate that. And yes,
Right.
the
Let's let Dr. Scridato do his thing. But what in your mind?
Take our names and develop this defense as Cortland did.
Pass a list around. But let's separate the two. Okay. The sludge
I'm not a
issue.
legislator. I can't do that.
The
Maybe
sludge
one of
issue
our
is.
legislators should pass a list.
I am a legislator, and with everybody talking, I can't understand what's going on.
Right.
I'm trying to learn about this issue.
Right.
We can be orderly, that's the only way that...
You would know about it, being a legislator.
Excuse me,
He does know about it.
The only way that I'm gonna learn as much as I want to learn, which is a heck of a lot, is be able to listen to everybody in an orderly fashion.
Yeah, I don't
Trying to
think.
conduct this orderly so that I can understand more.
Yeah, quite frankly, I think we're preaching to the choir here. We don't need to be so aggressive. The people who are whoever they are, the enemies, are not. Yeah, but the audience was a different audience. We're supposedly all the same group here. There's nobody here that's your enemy, and that's why I don't think we need to get to the level we are.
Well, the gentleman here just wants to dispose of it properly. He said it's okay.
I think we all want to dispose of it properly. I don't think anybody doesn't want to
Not with
dispose.
the county.
Yeah, as long as it's that's another thing. We can't be hypocritical and just ship it out and not worry about it.
It's not going to be here.
Well, I personally have a philosophical problem with just having it go outside of our political boundaries and not concerned about where it goes.
You say you're on
No,
record as
no,
saying
don't take me out of context. What I'm saying is, it's got to be disposed of in the best way that it can. And the fact of the matter is, it's already at the plants, but let's let Dr. Scordato do his
I
thing.
will pass this around. It will be a mailing list the town of Volney will set up so that any more information or any coordinating effort, we will know what the interested people in this audience were.
The activists in the audience,
Let me just make a couple of points. I don't want to take anything away from Judith's presentation, but there's been a comment in regard to production of radioactive waste within Oswego County relative to the rest of the state, and also with regards to Oswego County relative to even the country, and where this radioactivity comes from. And I think that's a very important matter to get before all of you so that you understand that we in Oswego County are a major producer of radioactive waste, low-level radioactive waste. And so that everyone has a perspective on this, I wanted to just share this information with you. It's a little bit out of date. This is 1991 data. There is 92. It's not significantly different from this. This was what's available to me right now. But if you take a look at this, you'll see that, and we're talking about volume, and this is in cubic feet, and that's an important factor to keep in mind because one of the ways to manage radioactive waste, low-level radioactive waste in particular, is to try to reduce the volume of it so that you don't have so much of it to deal with. Just like in solid waste, one of the biggest issues with regards to solid waste is the volume of it, not so much the weight. If you can reduce the volume, then your landfill can last much longer. Right, Mark? So if we take a look at volume in cubic feet, I know some of you in the back can't see that real well, and then also look at an important factor here, which is the total amount of curies produced by that waste. Can you all see this okay? No? Should I shift it? And it goes out of focus. Is that better? Okay. So if you take a look at the total amount of medical waste that's produced here in New York State, we're looking at about 13,000 cubic feet. That produces about the total of 12.6 curies. This is in the state, okay? 12.6 curies. Industrial waste, a fairly significant amount equal to the medical waste that's being produced, about 13,000 cubic feet again, but far more in terms of the total number of curies that are produced each year. Well over 800 curies being produced by the industrial sector. And one of the major producers of this low-level radioactive waste is this company called Syntachem Incorporated, which, by the way, is going to close down its reactor by the end of this year. So this percentage of the waste, by the end of 1994, this percentage of the waste, 816 curies and about 9,500 cubic feet of low-level radioactive waste, will disappear after this year, okay? Let's go into the academic. The colleges, the universities, it's a piddling amount, 2,000 cubic feet. They produce 6.1 curies in 1991. Thanks, Mark. No, I have to get to the bottom of that a little bit. Now, when you really get into the major producers, you're looking at the nuclear energy, or the nuclear energy power companies, the utility companies, nuclear power plants. You take a look at the total non-utility, this is in cubic feet in terms of the volume, and the total curies, around 920 total curies, which is about 0.9% in terms of the total non-utility production of low-level radioactive waste. In other words, less than 1% coming from all of the industries, all of the medical facilities, all of the universities, et cetera, all of the government, less than 0.1% in total in terms of the total curies. The nuclear power companies, the utility companies, are producing well over 100,000 curies each year in 1991. In terms of the total curie production, it's over 99% of the total waste. And if you take a look at Oswego County, because we have 3 reactors here, we are a significant contributor of the total curie and volume production on an annual basis. Now, you say, well, we don't want this stuff on site. And believe me, I don't want to live next to a nuclear dump either. I live on the lake, and I cherish where I live because I live on the lake, and I want to make sure that it stays as pure as possible. I don't want any threat to that particular facility. And that resource, it's an enormous resource. I mean, when you consider we and the Canadians use it for drinking water, we manufacture beer from it, We have an incredible recreational sport fishery that contributes millions of dollars to Oswego County. The last thing we want to do is to goof up that lake with any kind of contaminant, including radioactive waste. So I don't want to have a low-level radioactive waste facility in Oswego County on the shores of Lake Ontario. But for the life of me, I can't see where it makes a heck of a lot of sense to be shipping this stuff on the roads to other facilities within the state as well. I mean, there are problems associated with transportation. And if you have an accident within the Great Lakes Basin with transporting this material elsewhere, that stuff could wind up in the lake and in Oswego County anywhere. I mean, you have to remember, if we ship it to for instance, West Valley in time, West Valley drains into Lake Erie, which drains into Lake Ontario, and in fact there has been radioactive substances picked up in the sediments in Lake Ontario deriving from West Valley. So we're not isolated from being impacted by this particular material, even if it's disposed of elsewhere within the state. So, and that I think we've got to keep in mind. And I've got to ask people, if I was living in Onondaga County, whether or not I'd be concerned about the total non-utility number of curies, amount of curies, around 920, coming into Oswego County, or the over 100,000 curies going out of the county elsewhere. We need to keep those issues in perspective, I think, when we start saying, we don't want it here, I don't want it here, ship it anywhere but here, store it any place else but here. I think Mark stated it very nicely. I think we have a moral obligation. If we're going to make it, we need to take a primary role in ensuring that that waste is going to be managed most effectively. And the last thing I want to say is, just because this issue has come to the public's attention recently with regards to the closing of Barnwell, I mean, for all intents and purposes, we are a low-level radioactive waste, high-level radioactive waste management facility right now. What do you think they're doing with the rods? The rods are being stored on site. That's essentially a waste. They don't know what else to do with it until they reprocess it. And they're also going to be storing low-level radioactive waste on site as an interim facility because of the closure of Barnwell. We have it, friends, and there's no way that we're going to get rid of it anytime in the near term.
Yeah, there is.
If you think you're going to force other parts of the state to take it because we're not taking it, I think you're kidding yourself. And I don't care how vocal you become, okay? And I don't think all of the vocal outpouring that occurred when this area was designated as one of the candidate sites turned the tide. The tide was turned because this is a lousy site. It's a lousy location. It's on the shores of Lake Ontario, and that's why it wasn't. And I'm sure that John McHugh and others played a role in this, but it was not the definitive role. That's all I want to say. Look, I don't want to take any more away from Judith's talk.
I want to answer a question about this, that this concerns me. You're talking in 1 year.
That's right.
Okay. And we're looking at almost 82,000 cubic feet of nuclear waste.
Volume, right.
When you've got that type of a volume, what facility, wherever, can take any amount for any amount of years?
They're going to burn it. They're going to reduce it. They're going to reduce the volume either with an on-site incinerator at 9 Mile Point, at one of the facilities probably that'll serve all three, or they're going to ship it someplace else and burn it and return the ash. That's what they're going to do. So just storing this material is not the issue, because in the near term, and I'd say in the near term, probably within the next, maybe shorter, but probably within the next few years, we're going to see an incinerator being proposed at 9 Mile Point.
Oh, great.
What's
Yeah.
our baseline health study? Something we have begged for in this county for 20 years.
Look, one of the things that really bothers me about this whole issue is that we conducted an assessment of the NRC required monitoring at 9 Mile Point. Now, I do a lot of this work on inactive hazardous waste sites and on landfills, and I've been involved with it for over 25 years, unfortunately, that long. That monitoring program at 9 Mile Point is pathetic. There's no other way to describe it, because it will not determine whether or not there is a problem out there with regards to discharges to the water, discharges to the groundwater, discharges to the air, or discharges to any part of that environment. You can't tell what's going on out there. And we've looked at those reports very carefully, and that's one of the real problems that I have with this site being designated as a management facility because there is no way to determine whether or not, in fact, it is operating effectively. Judith?
There are a couple of other aspects of this that I think we better deal with that are coming up. We're at that point in the nuclear fuel cycle where we're having to face lack of adequate solution to the problem. And it is tearing us, those of us who care about health and safety in the environment, to pieces because we don't know what to do, and neither do they. And our tendency is to say, ship it off someplace else. Let somebody else deal with it. Send it to the dry land, to the desert, that most fragile environment. But what we desperately need in our society is to meld these concerns, all the way from those uranium miners out in the reservations, through the people who are living already with radioactive waste. And indeed, every reactor is a radioactive waste storage site when the waste is at its hottest, when it's first coming out of a reactor. Now, look what is ahead, please. Within this month, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is expected to release its new compatibility requirements. And what they're going to say is that the states are not permitted to be more restrictive in their standards than the NRC. No, they won't allow it. The state program managers confronted the NRC staff last week. They were practically pounding the table and saying, listen, we've got an obligation to protect our people in our states. We want to set more restrictive standards. And I think that those state people need to work with the local citizen groups who are concerned to say, we've got to have more protective standards than those of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which by federal law is supposed to promote nuclear power even today, and nuclear weapons even today under federal law. Okay? Now we have some additional problems coming up, because we haven't even talked about what happens when the utilities finally do have to shut down their reactors, and there are serious safety problems at the boiling water reactors. Okay? So I think we can anticipate shutdown of a number of reactors in the near future. Now we're looking at decommissioning. And that's what that below regulatory concern was all about. And let me read to you what is in the earlier draft of the proposed decommissioning standards. Think what this means for a power plant. They're planning to set 2 or 3 levels for unrestricted sites after they've been decontaminated, and then some restricted sites after they've been partially decontaminated. And then here's what the NRC said on June 5th. The Commission estimates that there may be a few tens of licensed sites containing large quantities of materials contaminated with low-level radioactivity where health and environment may best be protected by on-site stabilization and disposal, despite the failure to meet the 100 millirem per year dose cap. What they're proposing is to exclude some tens of sites, and I think that means the nuclear power reactors principally. To exclude those, exempt them from the standards for decommissioning. And the Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, will deal with those cases case by case. And they go on to add disposition of these sites with some type of durable institutional control may be necessary to ensure long-term protection of the public and environment, such as placing the site under the custody of a state or federal agency. At a meeting of the spent fuel group called by the utility commissioners last spring that I was part of, one of the commissioners, or one of the utility executives, proposed that the utilities can solve their spent reactor fuel problem, the high-level waste stored on site, where DOE doesn't have any place to take it to, they can solve that problem by deeding over a portion of the utility reactor site where they're storing the spent reactor fuel, deed it over to the Department of Energy. And the utility will clean up its reactor site, maybe, maybe not, and walk away. And so I suggest to you that that's one of the major points that's ahead. We are, I believe, looking at the permanent use of existing contaminated sites for permanent disposal, if this is approved. Now, they did promise us that they had taken it out of the version that they're going to submit to the public for public comment. But I have a sneaking suspicion that that's going to end up again in the final version of their criteria. The other point is this. Regarding low-level radioactive waste siting, the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission last Tuesday said the following, and this is not a direct, positive, exact quote, but it's pretty darn close. After wasting a great deal of time and money, the U.S. is within sight of having new low-level waste sites. When enough sites have been built, and it's not a matter of machismo for the states. Did you know this was a machismo matter for the states? And he said maybe 3 or 4 low-level waste sites, or maybe as many as 10 or 11. The states will know when there are enough. You know what that's saying? The whole low-level radioactive waste disposal law in 1980 came about because it was said that the National Governors Association asked Congress for the authority. I have talked and listened in public to, or listened to the person who was behind that decision, and what he said was the National Governors Association never voted, never addressed this compacting issue and the low-level waste siting issue. It had been folded into another issue concerning nuclear reactors, and the governors never knew what they were voting for back in 1979, 1980. But it became the law, and Congress says today, oh, the governors wanted it. Now what the chairman of the commission is saying is, when we have a few of those sites in operation, then we'll arrange for the states to go back to Congress and say, okay, that's enough. The first ones with sites get to be the national sites. And the commissioner added, I tell the Hill, Congress, just let nature and economics take its course. And I suggest to you that means that particularly New York State, one of the last in the country not to have joined a compact, is particularly vulnerable for consideration as a national low-level waste site. And I say also we've got to work ourselves all together around all of these aspects. We've got to consolidate our concerns about human health and the quality of the environment and the safest possible management of these radioactive wastes so that the generations that follow us will also be able to continue the management of what we've created in this half century. Getting angry about it is important. Getting active about it is even more important. Getting political about it, and I am delighted that legislators in this county are political about this issue. It is a matter of political decision-making. We can go on generating more, or we can stop generating more. Yeah, there's some other people back here with questions.
Speaking of politicians, Shirley Tabor wanted to make a quick comment here.
Usually everybody can hear me without this, so probably a few of the legislators will say so. But, you know, we faced this the other day at our meeting, and I said, can you hear? Do you want that, Floyd? I hate mics. Okay. We faced this the other day at our meeting, and we came to terms. And I can tell you I've been in contact with DEC, and they've sent out reports. Reports were sent to every place but Volney in the county about what was coming out of the power plants. And when yes, on the sludge. This was on the sludge. And I had the DEC tell me point blank that the county didn't get it. It was an oversight on the DEC. Well, the bottom line is I don't want too many more oversights on the DEC. And if you really want to know what I feel you can do, the bottom line is I think you need to write the DEC, write Langdon March, put pressure on Langdon March, because just as Mark said, we have voted to say, no, we're not going to take it. It's going to be Langdon March's decision whether they're going to grant us lead agency. I mean, we've already said we want lead agency, and I will follow it to my death if I have to, because I feel that way. And I'm not a sky is falling person, but I do honestly feel that if they start putting a little bit, see, on the permits, the way the permits act, we are a Part 380 landfill. 360, I'm sorry. 360, the difference between a 360 and a 380 means that we don't take radioactive material. But they're going to grant NIMO and Fitzpatrick 380 permits. And in their permits, the only place that is designated is Minetto to go for the septage, and from Minetto to Bristol Hill. It's not saying we can ship it up to Rodman or wherever in the state. It has to go to us, and it has to go to Minetto if they get these permits granted. So bottom line is, and they've already said in a letter, we are prepared to give a negative declaration, meaning we are going to give, we as in DEC are going to give the power plants their permits. If we become lead agency, if DEC becomes lead agency, they are going to give the permits, which will then make them a 380 facility and will be permitted to dump in our 360 landfill. Now, we've already passed a resolution saying we want lead agency, but Langdon March is going to make that decision. So you want to do something? He's got 12 days from the 25th. Start writing letters. Start telling them. You don't want it, make some other decisions. Now, I do see a possibility on the septage. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, and maybe Mark can give me a nod or something. Is it possible, Mark, that they can take this septage and put it in with the higher level of low-level radioactive as opposed to being separated? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it's... I mean, bottom line is we've got a problem. Okay. I mean, yeah. At the time. We've got a problem. There's no doubt. We have it, and what are we going to do with it? But let's do it in the most common sense way to do it. We don't want it right now, and let's not let DEC make our decision for it.
We don't have it. Snyder Mohawk and Fitzpatrick have it.
I know,
What
yeah.
about the good neighbor policy of our nuclear plants? And why...
Well, I'm not saying we county.
No.
Okay.
Why are they asking for this permit at this point when they know that it's causing...
Well, see, the bottom line is my understanding. Okay, my understanding is before, I mean, everything went to Barnwell. It wasn't regulated at this point. But now we can't even send it to Barnwell. We can't even tell them, take this, put it with the stuff you're taking to Barnwell and take it. They can't take it.
I don't think they ever sent their septage to Barnwell.
No, but they could have. I mean, that was their decision, but it was less costly to send it to Minetto than it was to the other. But the bottom line is now they can't even send it to Barnwell. They have it at the plant.
What really, I think, is starting to cross me is the fact that we have an industry in this county that is being absolutely ignorant and choosing to ignore a very strong outcry in this county that they cease and desist on insisting that this $87,000 or whatever, why put Minetto in that situation where they have to turn down, they're in a corner, and then the county is ready to bar its gates?
Mm-hmm.
What is this industry? Why are they not responsive
Go
to
ahead.
this?
You want this, Mark?
Let me answer that before. Basically, this material, and Cindy probably knows more about this than I do, but has either always gone to a sewage treatment plant or was disposed of in some other method other than disposing of radioactive waste. Yeah, I think some of it went to a nursery in previous years. But what happened was a regulation at the state level changed, I can't remember, I think it was 1988, which required them to then send reports that they generate this stuff and to get a permit to transport it. So it was really a state rule change. the material was always there and it was always managed a certain way, but it was only until the state changed their law saying they'd have to get this Part 380 permit that they had to start submitting documents. So it's really been since 1988, and we only found out last year.
But is it possible that the regulation was passed because this stuff is possibly hazardous?
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting that that regulation happened at the same time that the low-level siting process was going on. So it's just.
Can I say something? In their application for Fitzpatrick, they talk about an 11.5 additional millirem exposure 2 years to the public. That's just from Fitzpatrick. Now we have 3 nuclear plants out there, so let's times that times 3, because you assume that they're about the same. That comes out to about 34.5 millirem additional exposure to the general population. When they're going to build the dump in New York State, they're talking about 25 millirem exposure. I believe that they are using the sludge as a vehicle, and I will repeat it again, to dump more than just dermal, sinks.
But that's what we're worried about, Cindy. That's what we're worried about.
They're going to bypass the siting commission and build a dump, use Volney as the New York State nuclear dump without paying a community, host benefits, and without giving us an environmental impact statement. And the other thing that I want to say is that I'm very afraid that on-site storage may not be the right way to go. I'm very concerned about them starting to incinerate, because whether you people know it or not, 95% of all dry activated waste from all nuclear plants in New York State since '91 has been incinerated at SCG in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. They make it solidified into concrete blocks in those winter barn wells. But they're going to come back to the plants now, and they can't guarantee curies because they burn everyone, together. Well, that's going to get too expensive. And Niagara Mohawk in 1980 wanted to build the first nuclear incinerator in the country, and a citizen stopped it. And I believe that you're going to see very quickly within the next year out there them doing incineration. And I'm very concerned as to where the ash will go.
Okay,
I do
Cindy.
not know if they will solidify it. And then I would like Judith at the end to address West Valley and what her feelings are on that, since our state is looking so closely at that.
Cindy, can I say something? Because we're getting at 9:30, and I'm sure a lot of people are tired, but I'm sure you want to get as much information as you can. Please be aware that we're fighting 2 issues here. We're fighting a landfill issue, and we're fighting a low-level, a low-level issue. And we're not going to cure everything this evening. The bottom line is, I think one of the reasons this meeting was held was to assure the people here that there are county officials who are aware of this, have put their foot down as much as we can at this point, but we also need comment period to the DEC. And it's got to be done soon, because Langdon March will make their final decision, and we only have till the 25th to let them know we want lead agency, and as I'm not sure, somebody said tonight, 12 days after that, and he'll make his decision. Now, we can only do what we can do. We can shut the doors of the landfill. Yes, we can do that. But, and I think we should. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is there's a lot of this that we're going to be facing. This isn't all going to be decided tonight. We need for you to know that we're on top of the issue. I'm following with the DEC. I know other people are following with the DEC. Town of Volney's following with the DEC. We're just trying to allow you people to understand what we're up against so that you understand we're working in your interest.
Agency. And if they want to start incinerating tomorrow, Shirley, New York State, nor the county, nor the DEC can tell them nor will they come to us ahead of time.
Your state officials have got to be called and written to.
Do we have the address to write to?
The state officials have no control over the NRC.
I think I do have it.
They don't even answer to Congress.
That's not true. There is part of the on-site legislation that they did not pass, Albany, and I don't have to pass, was that there would be no incineration.
They cannot stop incineration.
Excuse me.
They cannot stop it.
Just a second, please.
Cindy, why don't you go ahead and let the
I'd
lady.
like to introduce myself. My name is Susan Griffin. I'm a member of Don't Waste New York and Chenango North Citizens Against Radioactive Dumping.
Yeah, good. Glad you're here.
We, for years, have been trying to come to Oswego because we realized throughout this time that the only, and not solution, but the only answer was to stop the production of nuclear waste.
Right.
But through the years, we have not even been able to get one letter to the editor
in your local papers in order to do that.
Oh.
I am here tonight to pledge to you that all the citizens groups that have gone as far as we've come in New York State will be at your side to close these plants down.
That was on site.
What if, here's a representative of the newspaper. Are you printing the editorials in the newspaper?
And I have,
I think she's probably trying to post standard more than anything.
and I have a packet of
You can call for
information.
on-site, and the citizens in this state need to know that you lobbied for on-site. And you lobbied for it not knowing the consequences.
Could we just hold on, take like a big breather for a second? Can we just keep these two issues separate? I think we're real close to closure on the landfill issue, and I just want to know if anybody has any more questions or concerns. Just a second. Just relax for a second. About the landfill, then we can talk about how you want to go forward with the low-level radioactive waste potential at the plants. He had a question down the back. I'll definitely choose on you, don't worry.
I don't work for IMO, but I would like to play devil's advocate. On-site isn't going to work over the long run. Putting it out here at Bristol Hill isn't going to work over the long run. The only thing that's going to work over the long run is to stop producing the waste. And to stop producing the waste, don't be clapping in. To stop producing the waste, then we're going to have to quit generating the electricity, and I would ask you, where are we going to get it? Because that's...
Okay, hold on.
You want to ask me, why are you asking me that?
I want everyone here to understand that that's really the question. They didn't put that out there to generate nuclear waste. They put that out there.
Site's here.
I guess there's no more questions relating to the sludge in the landfill, because that's what I had asked. I want to make sure that everybody's comfortable with that.
I have a question about that.
There is that third question out there.
Right, us not taking the sludge at the landfill is not going to shut the nuclear power plants down. Okay, I mean, that's, just clarify that.
Do you have a map of how the direction of leachate travels, at what levels, and
Wait a minute. Leachate travels into the leachate tank.
well,
Groundwater?
groundwater?
That's right out in my truck, as a matter of fact. I got a whole pile of them. I was going to bring them in, but I didn't know if anybody would be interested. If you want to hang around, I'll show them to you right afterwards. Basically, the groundwater under Bristol Hill is a hard, what farmers would call hard pan or fragipan type clay soil. The water travels to the two streams. There's one stream on the eastern side. I can't remember. One of them is Bell Creek, and the other one is, I can't remember, but it's on the other side. Right. First of all, it takes 300 years for the water to get from the Bristol Hill site to one of those creeks. That's how slow the water travels through the clay. Very slow. But yeah, eventually, 300 years from now, could get into the creek. And then the drainage basin for those two creeks is the Oneida River, okay, which eventually then comes back up through the Oswego River. It is not over an aquifer. That's one of the things that I wanted to correct. I've heard the last couple of meetings. Bristol Hill is not over an aquifer. An aquifer is technically a sand and gravel area. Sand and gravel has large spaces between the sand and the gravel. It holds a lot of water. If any of your houses are over that type material, you probably have excellent wells. Bristol Hill is over a clay material, which it's very difficult to get water out of clay. Clay holds more water than sand and gravel, but you can't get it out of there because it attaches to the clay particles. But the Fulton aquifer is just a couple of miles east of us, and the Sand Ridge aquifer is a couple of miles west of us in the town of Palermo. Those are the two closest aquifers to the landfill site. And we have test wells. We know if there was ever a leak at the landfill, the first thing that would happen is it would show up in one of our test wells right around the landfill. The second line of defense, if you will, is it would show up in people's houses that we test around the landfill. It would show up in the streams that we test. So if there's a problem at the landfill, the first place we're going to see it is in the wells around the landfill, which we haven't seen yet.
Okay, on the sludge issue, the major concern is that we become a lead agency.
Right.
Now you're telling us that it's rubber stamp the job. We're going to go to the DEC, they're going to rubber stamp it, and they're the lead agency. It's a no entity, a non-entity. Back again, like this gentleman here says, we need warm bodies up here stopping the shipments of the radioactive waste into our dump.
Let's understand what happens at that point, okay? Let's just assume the DEC wins lead agency. Okay, then one of the things they did, which is a big snafu, which Shirley mentioned, is they already said they put a negative deck on this. That means They made a statement saying this is no big deal, we're going to issue these permits to the utilities. They're not supposed to make that statement until they've gone through the establishment of a lead agency and until they've reviewed the environmental forms. So they're making that statement as putting the cart before the horse, and that severely concerns the county because it means that they're making that statement without even reviewing any of the material that could come out of a public meeting, public hearings. So let's assume the DEC wins lead agency. We have to then, if we lose and they get lead agency, then we have to start writing letters saying, well, why did you negative deck this? We want more environmental information. We want a public hearing. That would be the next step. Then worst case scenario is they're just going to go ahead and award the permits, okay? The county has already said, no, we're not taking it. So Minetto is then put in a situation. Do they still take the material and try to find another home for it? But the DEC has surely said is only allowing them to take it to Bristol Hill. So there's a real catch-22 situation here.
If they take it, there's no tie, because the only place they'll be permitted to take it is Bristol Hill. And if we shut the door from Minetto. Now, Minetto can take this, and then once they do, they may have to try and permit it to some other landfill, and then that would be, which is what they'll do.
Well, they've been taking it up till now because they get $87,000 and ship it to us. That's easy to see. We would do that.
You gotta understand, and I honestly, I mean, I'm a very, how do you wanna put that, Mark?
I'm not going to put it. I would never put words in your mouth.
I don't trust a lot of people. Okay? Is that fair to say? And so consequently, when they told me that we didn't know about all these shipments, I said, yeah, sure, right, okay, fine. So I did. I nailed a couple people in different areas of the DEC on a response, okay, just to see what they had to say about it. And I had them tell me. One guy said, it came out of our region, but it came out of another area of our region. They assumed, that's a good word, everybody uses that, we assume, okay? They assumed, for whatever reason, that we and Volney were getting the reports. They had no indication why, and it had been given to our landfill, so nobody raised a fuss, so they just assumed that we knew about it. And as Mark said,
We've always taken Minetto sludge. We take sewage sludge from Parrish and Pulaski, and unless Minetto or Parrish or Pulaski or Central Square we test it for chemicals. We test it for every toxic chemical there is. We couldn't test it for that radioactivity. It's so low we wouldn't be able to afford it. So there's got to be an element of faith somewhere here. Just enters into it that we would have been told this and we weren't. Which is kind of a shame to find out through the media or somebody else. Reverend Edmund had his hand up.
Mark, how can you stand there and say that the leachate is not being run off into the swamp and reaching the different creeks when we've got pictures of the leachate bypassing the holding tank into a man-made pond and going into the swamp and polluting all of the streams to Peter Scott Swamp and the rest? I mean, it's getting into the food chain.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to see them. This is the first time I've ever heard of any pictures of anything, and if it's that big a concern, then they should have been brought to somebody's attention a long time ago. But let me finish and clarify what you're talking about. I brought Supervisor Rose around the landfill a couple of months ago and showed him the whole situation. What you're talking about is a construction pond. If you're familiar with construction, you have to have a sediment pond to collect sediment from runoff on a construction site before that water can be released into the environment. That pond you're talking about is directly adjacent to our landfill liner construction area. If you go up to our landfill, which you probably have been back there, you'll see a lot of open areas of dirt where we're building the new liner. And a lot of that clay gets into the water, and if we didn't have that pond there, it would go out into the wetland out back there, which used to be a muck farm. We test that same stream. There has been no leachate in there, and I can make all of those records available to you. There is another place on the landfill site that you're talking about. There was a good 5 years ago, there was a film made of water coming out of the landfill and just going right out into the wetland. That water was drainage water from the outside of the capped part of the landfill, going out underneath a culvert in the road. If you go, I can take you out there tomorrow if you want to stop by, and I'll show you the drainage ditch around, just like you'd have on the side of a road, which collects rainwater and just dumps it out happens to go out into the swamp there. Now, I'd be remiss if I were to tell you that there's never, ever a leachate pop-out or something on the side of our landfill. It happens periodically where you can walk on the side of the old part of the landfill, and you might be able to see a little area there that's brown. That means methane gas has popped out, because methane chooses the quickest way to get out of a landfill. And with that methane, there may be some leachate. Leachate is the stuff that leaks through the landfill. There might be some of that there. We have to get up there and correct that. We have to do it all the time. Get up there and fix that spot. There's different ways you have to do that. Has that leachate ever gotten into the water? I'm sure it has during a heavy rain situation. How much of it? Not enough to even register on tests that we do quarterly around the landfill. The way you made it sound is that leachate is pouring out into the swamp, which is absolutely not the case. There is probably a pop-out that's occurred, and next time I see one, I'll call you up and bring you out so you can look at it, so you can see what I'm talking about. But that's what you're referring to. And if you have pictures of anything else than what I explained, I think it would behoove you, if it's that critical, that you should have brought it to somebody's attention a long time ago and let me see them. Well, then recently, then. I definitely want to see it, because I don't want that. Why would I want that situation to occur? It's not any benefit to me to have that happen out there. And incidentally, while we're on this subject, I want everybody to know before everybody leaves that I moved my office from Oswego down to the landfill. And I want to give you my phone number, my direct phone number, if anybody has a pen, because I pride myself. I want to tell you, I'm not a believer in landfills. I am not a believer in landfills. I think it's a shame that we have to have landfills and have to throw our trash away. So I want to make that last and operate the best it can. And I guess you just have to take me at my word on that. But it's 592-3440. 592-3440. And Mark Lichtenstein. And also, I'll give you my home phone number, and you can call anytime if you have any concerns. 963-0856. I just think there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of misunderstanding, and I pride myself on dealing fairly and honestly with the public. And solid waste is not a pretty thing. It has to be done, and hopefully we're doing it the best we can.
Okay, if anybody wants to write to Langdon Marsh,
It's 50 Wolf Road, Albany, New York, 12223. The other people that it would do you good to contact, the pro-brochures that are over by the door, list all the officials, their phone numbers, and their addresses. Those are the people that have some impact on this. The other thing is, if it's not in there, but if you would contact Minetto officials, the town board and the supervisor of the town of Minetto, they're saying, well, the DEC gets to decide. Yes, but the county has asked for lead agency. The town of Volney, as a board, has voted unanimously to endorse the county's bid for lead agency. If the town of Minetto, as another involved agency, also endorsed the county as lead agency, it would make it very difficult for Langdon Marsh not to give the lead agency to the county, since all of the other involved agencies except themselves are requesting it. So please contact board members and the supervisor of the town of Minetto and express your concerns. They have until, they have to have this information to the DEC by July 25th. They have time to call a special board meeting if necessary to discuss this.
I have to say something in defense of Minetto, and I know that sounds terrible, but you know, as a small town, and the need for your dollars, any way you can get it. For many years this went on, and this was not brought to the attention. I mean, if you were responsible for a town and trying to keep your taxes in line, just a minute, and somebody came up to you and said, look, this stuff is harmless. I mean, the state has told us it's harmless. We have all the paperwork that says it's harmless. It's just septic. All it is out of our sewer. It's not out of the main part. It's just out of where people go to the bathroom and take a shower. Okay? We'll pay you $80,000 for it because we don't want to have to ship it way down to Barnwell. I think probably as officials who are looking out for their town people as far as taxes, without knowing, not knowing that there was problems, probably thought they were doing the best for their people. Now it has come to the head. It came to the head in November or September, October. Now they're going to have to make a decision. Now they have something that they have to look strongly on. And yes, they're looking at you and they're saying, you live in my town, we're going to have to raise your taxes by $80,000 to make up that difference. So I, being a legislator and knowing what I have to face on a budget, I know what they have to face on a budget. And prior to this coming to a head in the newspaper, I think they thought they were doing a favor to the town people, not being negative. So I have to say that much for them. You know, now I have to say you got to really look at this because you may end up with stuff that you can't get rid of. But at that point, okay?
Make something clear about the sewage that is going to Minetto. That $87,000 strictly goes for the sewer district. There is a great majority of Minetto that is not on sewers, that does not benefit from this money, that the only money is coming for the people who are on the sewer, which I am. The sewage treatment plant in Minetto is working at approximately 50% capacity. What we need as a business is to go out and to drum up some more business and take from other townships that cannot handle their sewage and forget the nuclear plant.
I'll send you some from Hastings. I guess Central Square's got a problem.
And what I'd like to know is of all the legislators, there's 36 of you, how many are committed
Well,
to this
they,
situation?
all right, yeah, we're all committed, but,
I understand it.
yeah,
It
no.
was an
At this
majority,
point,
but-
right, at this point on the resolution, everyone passed it. Everyone passed it, okay? And you may find that it may have said that I voted no, and if I voted no, what I said is we had a discussion as to I did not want the Public Works to take it over. I wanted the whole county to take it over. And so I argued that on the resolution. I said it should be placed in the county, Oswego County's hands and not the Oswego County Public Works hands. So if you pull the minutes, that's why it says that. Go ahead. I want to thank everyone for coming, and we're just going to address what we can here. Claudia, do you want to speak before everyone leaves, or are you all set? I think that, okay.
Thank everybody that did come, and as more information gets out, if you put your name on that list, we will mail it out to you.
Go ahead.
Just two questions. Not long ago in the Post-Standard, it was addressed that the low-level siting commission allowed up to $100,000 for the communities to fight the commission itself.
I haven't got a clue.
You don't know about that?
No.
We could be getting those funds, upwards of $100,000 to fight this.
I have to apologize.
Number two,
I just come in.
Question number two, I heard two different reports. I heard one that that we are going to incinerate the nuclear waste right here at our power plants and high-level radioactive waste dump right here. And the other person said that the NRC has said this can't be a high-level waste dump here. There was two different people. Without a tape recorder, I can't prove it.
When the siting commission said they said that Oswego wasn't suitable as a low-level dump. Okay. Now, when you're talking high level, we store our own rods anyways here. We have ever since they've opened up.
But it can be high level.
It is a high-level site. We have ever since, right.
We have to do it.
DOE has no place currently to begin to take waste.
DOE has no place to begin to take the spent fuel as they are supposed to do under contract to the utilities starting in 1998. The utilities are demanding, and in fact 21 states have gone to court to force DOE to pay the utilities to babysit the waste that the utilities generated, and in that process deplete the nuclear waste fund that they've been collecting all these years. At the same time, the utilities are going after, on tribal lands in New Mexico, a privately financed interim storage site for the spent reactor fuel from, getting permission from the leadership of an Indian tribe where the Native Americans haven't even had a chance to voice their opinion on this, and they're about to get the fuel. The whole radioactive waste program of the United States is in deep, deep trouble. And many of us are requesting a White House independent commission to review this whole inadequate process. And I would be delighted to have county and municipal officials joining in the request to our Congress people and the senators in Washington and directly to the White House for us to have a pause in this whole production end and get to a better arrangement for radioactive waste management. And management is going to be the key, even if we shut down reactors, and some people in some areas are going to get hurt. But yes, all of us are. But we have an obligation to one another. We have the obligation to the people at West Valley. We have the obligation to people in every other site to bring ourselves together. Now, Cortland County as well, they may end up getting some after all. We are all...
You tell that to them.
Yeah, well, it's the reality.
Well, maybe we should
So
bring them
long,
here.
excuse me, so long as we continue to generate more and more of these wastes, more and more sites are going to have to get contaminated because we don't have the means of assured safe disposal. So, you know, the person in the back asked about alternatives. The electric utilities are breaking up. They cannot compete with the independent power producers. Sadly, we've gone to the use of natural gas before we have changed our attitudes and our practices. What we should be doing is maximizing conservation and efficiency right now and learning to live on a slim electricity budget. We should be minimizing our use of electricity and developing the alternatives. I would love to see wind energy on Lake Ontario putting folks to work here with alternatives.
We're here to get the dump out of here, that's all.
That's, well, but they fit together. And please, please, in your thinking, all of us, be comprehensive. Be comprehensive and be cognizant of the equal rights of all others with ourselves.
Somebody wants the dump here? They have equal rights?
Excuse me.
You want the dump here? You want the dump here in Volney? What's your name? Dick Tooney? Where do you live?
Yeah. Linda?
You want a dump here?
When we,
Excuse me, someone else is trying to speak. You've had several opportunities.
missing the point, because when those plants were built out there, our county government signed off the land. They knew that it would be forever contaminated. Forever contaminated. They said, it's yours anyway. You're missing the whole point. Portland doesn't generate the radioactive waste we do, and as a county, if we're going to be reaping all those benefits.
Well, we don't generate the waste. That electricity goes downstate.
The waste is generated at the nuclear power plants. That is the principal source. And if you insist that you want that electricity, then I think there's a real responsibility for the waste that is generated. If you're not willing to have the waste, then it's time to use some other means to generate the electricity we need.
First, you gotta get the dump and the plants out of here.
The two are going to go together. All of these things fit together, the technology, the politics, and the economics. You folks have been so patient. And good luck. I am thrilled to find the shift in attitude in Oswego County, because it was home to me and to my son for a while, and I'm so pleased. So thanks.
The preceding program was not a New Channels production, and New Channels has no responsibility for the content or opinions expressed therein.